Well, the thing I've been really struggling with is understanding the questions of technology and the economy. There's this narrative that's happening today about AI and jobs, and it's pretty clear to me based on history that it's wrong. History teaches us that if we use technology correctly, we actually increase productivity. And that the fundamental questions that we're facing today are not the question of, that somehow technology will inevitably put people out of work, that this time is different. It's the question of what we have to do differently in order to get a different outcome. It's not technological determinism. It's really, the future is determined by the choices we make. And if you look at history, of how we've dealt with past technological revolutions, there's been kind of a social conscience that arose where we decided to change the way our society works. And we seem to be in the throes of this determinism today. And a lot of what I'm trying to figure out is, how do we change the rules of the game? How do we get people to think differently about the future? Because it's pretty clear to me that there is plenty of work to be done that technology can help us with. Huge problems to be solved. And the thing I've been most wrestling with is what's keeping us from putting today's technology to work on those problems and forcing us to spend time on so much triviality. And in particular, I'm thinking a lot about what kind of advice could I, as a technologist, give to policymakers, to people in Washington or Brussels or in China, to say, here's what you ought to be doing. Here's what the real path of technology teaches us. And, here are the choices that you should be setting up for our society. This is the leadership that you should be exerting. So one of the things that I've spent my life doing is engaging with computer platforms. I began my career in the age that was dominated by Microsoft. It was just throwing off the bonds of the IBM monopoly. And I became very strongly associated with the open source software movement, the early commercial internet. And I was really looking at this sort of conflict of worldviews between a company that was increasingly, that started out creating a lot of value in the computer industry, and then increasingly started to capture that value for itself. I remember this one conversation I had with Walt Mossberg, where he recounted a conversation he had with Steve Ballmer, where he said, Steve, if you guys would be 5% less greedy, the world would like you 100% more. And now I'm watching that dynamic play out again with Google, where, for example, they are, despite their don't be evil, they're becoming the focus of antitrust investigations. Did they abuse their market power? And I look at these patterns in platforms where they start out in this burst of optimism and creation of public value, and then gradually they start turning away from that. And I'm trying to understand why, and how do we actually build long-lasting companies that create a balance between the company and its ecosystem, the platform and its ecosystem. Because of course, when Microsoft lost leadership, they lost it because they had taken away the opportunities for their developer ecosystem. And so those developers went over to the web, to the internet, and they moved to Google. And now we see the same thing playing out again. But most importantly, I'm thinking about, how does that dynamic play out in our broader economy? Because it seems to me that the same pattern that we've seen with technology platforms is playing out today in our broader economy, where financial markets in particular are basically have turned into an extractive monopoly rather than this support system for our economy. something like 85% of all corporate, quote, investment today goes to basically dividends and share buybacks. Very little to actual investment in people, building things, in R&D. It's all going into financial gamesmanship. And I started looking at the history of, or really the pattern, the design pattern, if you like, of algorithmic systems like Google and Facebook, and started thinking about how that applies to financial markets. So if you look at a system like Google, they have hundreds of factors that they're taking into account, but they all have a master objective function, or fitness function, which is we want to have relevance in our search results. We want to have relevance in our ads. And when you look at Facebook, their fitness function, their objective function is how do we have content that's engaging. And we saw how that went wrong with fake news. And Mark and the Facebook team are trying to deal with that. They're wrestling with, okay, we had this idea about how we were going to build this really engaging product, and it's been subverted. And now I look at our economic system where inequality is increasing, and I start asking myself, well, is that too something of a system that's dominated by an algorithm, and what are they trying to optimize for? And I sort of realized that 30, 40 years ago was the point in where we basically told companies that there's only one thing to optimize for, and that is shareholder value. And that's the point in the 70s where you see this great divergence between the productivity, the increased productivity brought on by technology, and the actual benefit to the economy, and where you see inequality soar, where you see people doing less well than their parents, all this work that Raj Chetty has talked about. And so, I kind of came around in some sense to think that in some ways financial markets are that rogue AI that people like Elon Musk have been talking about. He says, he kind of, everybody uses, Nick Bostrom, Elon Musk use these trumped up images. It's like the AI which has its objective function of making paper clips, or and so it says, well, I have to do that. Elon Musk used one recently about the strawberry picking robot that says, well, humans are in the way of my picking strawberries. That's what I've been told. And that's not, those aren't realistic. But what is realistic, is a world in which you have an increasingly algorithmic financial system which is saying, hey, optimize for corporate profit because it drives stock price, and never mind what happens to the people, never mind what happens to society. We're in that sort of AI-driven situation. The point is that it's not actually, fully autonomous AI. But the question that I'm wrestling with today is, what do we do about that? How do we change, how do we debug the objective function of an increasingly automated economy, of an increasingly of an economy that's dominated by systems that are, to use the great quote from Wallace Stevens, without human feeling, without human meaning, a foreign song. They're basically, we are living in the world of which is dominated by a system which really disregards human value. And so what I've been really thinking about are, what are the changes? When you look at something like fake news on Facebook, Mark, for example, is wrestling right now with how do we, we were kind of talking about engagement, and now we're trying to say, well, there's kind of an authentic engagement. We want more real community. We want to feel, we want to figure out how Facebook reinforces true social bonds as opposed to the fake bonds. And there's a bunch of work that's going on at Facebook to sort of figure that out. And I think of, again, this great quote from a guy named Andrew Singer, who many years ago said to me, he said that the art of debugging a computer program is to figure out what you really told the computer to do instead of what you thought you told it to do. And, so right now, Facebook is engaged in this struggle as is Google, say, well, what did we really tell the computer to do that wasn't quite what we meant? And we have to do that same thing in our society. We had this theory that if we optimized for shareholder value and corporate profit, and if we aligned the interests of shareholders and the interests of management, companies would prosper, the economy would prosper. And now, 30, 40 years on, we're looking at it and going, well, actually, it didn't quite work out that way. And the question is, what do we replace it with? And that's what I'm wrestling with. One of the things that I have been saying here is this we. And you might ask, who is the we? And there are a couple of key ideas, again, that I'm wrestling with. I don't think I have answers. But the first one, and probably the most important one, is this collective we of what we collectively believe. Because ultimately, what politicians do, what we do as a society, is a result of what millions of people, tens of millions of people, in this case, actually eventually billions of people, come to believe about the way the world is and what's right. So if you think back to the Middle Ages, everybody believed in the divine right of kings. And right now, everybody believes in the divine right of capital. It's only natural that, the owners of businesses, the owners of capital, should try to extract as much as possible for themselves and leave society in the lurch. That they should basically treat people as a cost to be eliminated. We accept that. And when I say we, I mean all of us accept it. We simply believe that that's the way the world works. And we ignore things that run contrary to that. A really good example, there are these isolated companies that are playing by totally different rules. Good example, co-op like REI. REI actually outperforms all of their public market competitors in measures in the traditional, actual real market activity. Their same store sales growth is higher. Their revenue per store is higher. They pay more to their employees. They're not very profitable, and they don't have a stock, right? So they just kind of vanish from the world because they give all of their profits back to their customers in the form of dividends. The Green Bay Packers, a storied football team owned by the fans who use their ownership to keep season ticket prices low. And, they're not any less successful than other companies. In fact, they're maybe more successful. But they just vanish from the narrative. And so the first thing, that I'm trying to get across is the we is the collective beliefs of society. Jeff Bezos once told a story at one of my conferences, which apparently he attributed to Danny Hillis. And Danny said that collective intelligence is that thing that decided that orange meant decaffeinated coffee. People, it was basically this, if you look into the history of it, it was during World War II, Sanka, which was making decaffeinated coffee, gave out orange coffee pots to diners. And then that became a symbol for orange coffee. Orange became a symbol for decaffeinated coffee. So, it's a meme. Now of course everybody thinks a meme is a picture and some text on the internet, but of course we know that as Richard Dawkins articulated it, a meme is simply an idea that spreads in the same way that a gene reproduces itself. And our world is full of ideas that spread. And I think spreading new ideas about the way the world could be different is a huge job for all of us. We have this sense of inevitability. We have this sense that the way the world is today, that the story we tell ourselves about the world is fixed, that it's somehow true. And I was shaped very early on in my life by the poetry of Wallace Stevens, and he kind of talked about reality as the quest for a supreme fiction. Like, what is it that we can collectively believe? and that we're trying to create an aesthetic vision for each other about the way the world ought to work. And of course, this is the subject of Yuval Noah Harari's book *Sapiens*. He basically goes through the history of humanity as the evolution of collective beliefs that allow us to act in certain ways that we were not previously able to. That religion, politics were all ways to get larger and larger groups of people to act in concert. Money, it's a fiction. To build an economy, debt. It was all. He talks about the invention of the future as something that you could invest in and move towards. And I think in a similar way, we have to look at the beliefs we have that limit what we can do as a society. So that's the first we that I'm talking about. But I think there's a much more proximate we, which is the set of politicians and intellectual actors of various kinds who shape that collective consciousness. And I think one of the things that's really interestingly different today is how much that collective consciousness is now shaped by media, on the internet, by Google, by Facebook. And so, we've seen this with the dark turn that we've taken, as a result of fake news, where these systems have reinforced and brought out and amplified dark beliefs. And I think, there's this. I think one of the things that's somewhat dangerous is, we're feeding the beast, and there is a role for real leadership. And I think it's sort of interesting. I just started reading Ira Katznelson's book about the New Deal called Fear Itself. And he talked a lot about, in the 30s, there was this sort of belief that, there was literally talk, America needed a Mussolini, a strong leader who would, knock heads and get everybody moving in the right direction. And that liberal democracies were not, able to pull it together to have concerted action and clear focus. And we're kind of back there today, where we think that nothing can be done through the political process. And I think that we do need a kind of inspired leadership that is not just, responding to, micro, targeting and trying to manipulate people, but really comes from, a vision, and is able to communicate that vision, and is able to sell that vision, and get people to believe in it. When you look at history, it's all about people who had amazing persuasive skills to say, we should believe in this together. You think about Napoleon escaping, from Elba and coming back, and despite having been defeated, all of France rises again. This guy had an amazing ability to compel belief, and and obviously, you see that in today's politics. Trump has been able to bring out the beliefs of an untapped set of people, and I think in a similar way, but I hope a much more positive way, we need leaders who can, summon up a vision of a more just, a more fair, a more equitable world, one that is tackling the great problems. You look at something like climate change, and yes, it's great to see that someone like Elon Musk is trying to move the ball forward, show that you can make a successful business in electric cars, you can make a successful business in solar energy, and for that matter, that you can go to space. Elon is a dream maker for people. He's resetting the expectations of what's possible. But I think we also need that in the political realm. And the thing that I find the one thing I find hopeful in the rise of Donald Trump is that he's broken a lot of the old paradigms, a lot of the old ideas that sort of have to go in lockstep. And the question is, can we invent a new map of the world that makes more sense? that reinvents what's possible. And the thing that worries me a lot, and I think about this in the context of my history, of being a classicist, and you look at the fall of Rome, what happens is people lose focus and they lose will, they become reactive, and by the time the real crisis comes, they don't really have the capacity anymore to rise to it. And that's the thing I worry about. You think about climate change and the opportunity. Not only is the clock ticking and the problem getting worse, and we should have been acting sooner, but we're going to lose our capacity to respond because so much of our productive capacity is going to be just dealing with crisis. You look at what happened in Houston, what's happening in Florida, and it's just this, hey, we just got to repair. And so I don't expect change to happen in an instant. The question, though, is it happening fast enough for us to avoid disaster? Because I think our current system is not up to the challenges. We are now struggling with this, great crisis of climate change. And long before he was worried about superintelligence, Nick Bostrom wrote a fantastic piece about Fermi's paradox. And he said something like, every time there's a new discovery of exoplanets, for example, I'm elated because it means there's a chance, a greater chance that there's life elsewhere in the universe. But I'm also dismayed because it means that the great winnowing is still ahead of us instead of behind us. If there were very few planets and we were on one of them, then maybe nobody's out there because life is rare. But if if planets are common and life is rare, then where are they becomes a much more frightening question, because it says that civilizations don't last. And I read that piece and I thought a lot about that in the context of climate change. And, it made me wonder about, one of the possibilities might be that, actually civilization falls. We've used up all the cheap fossil fuel. Civilization falls as a result of climate change. We don't necessarily get entirely wiped out. But when we come back, that source of cheap energy, a cheap available energy, is not really there. And so we don't build technological civilization. We get back up to maybe the level of the Victorian era, because that's what you can do with the energy sources that are available. And that would be a possible answer to Fermi's paradox. But, I kind of digress, because I guess I'm just thinking a lot about what are the interventions that we need. And I do think, the world is going to intervene. One of the big fallacies that we all live with, of course, is that the world is somehow under our control. And you look at, the lesson of history, of course, is that unexpected things happen. Things happen in different parts of the world. And, natural disasters happen. And there's so many possibilities that could, completely upset our world, sometimes in a terrible way, but then in a much better way. Because if you look back, for example, at history, one of the things that broke the feudal system was the Black Plague. Suddenly there were fewer workers, and they became much more powerful as a result. They became much more valuable to people. And, so there can be some really unexpected things in our future. And again, I'm not trying to say, well, let's just rely on that. But I think a lot about the wonderful, insight from scenario planning, that what you want to have is a robust strategy. That is something that can, that will be useful in a wide range of possible futures. And, we have a possible future in which there's global conflict. We have a possible future in which there is natural disaster. We have a possible future in which we make a just egalitarian society where the world is more productive and better off than it's ever been, and it has a very different economic system than we have today. All these are possibilities. And the question is, well, what should we be doing? And the job that I'm trying to do right now is to articulate a narrative. And in some ways it's the biggest narrative that I've ever tried in my life. A lot of what I've done in my career has been reframe the narrative, redraw the map. And now I'm trying to really reframe this question of what do computer platforms and their rise and fall tell us about society and economies and their rise and fall. And there's this wonderful conclusion that Ryan Avent comes to at the end of his book, The Wealth of Humans. And it really is that generosity is the robust strategy, where we really look out for other people. Bob Putnam said to me, the famous sociologist, authored Bowling Alone and many other books. We were in a Markle Foundation working group about the future of the economy. And he said, every great advance in our society has come when we have made investments in other people's children. And he was referring to, universal, grade school education, universal high school education, the GI Bill, and these investments in the future that are not self-interested have in fact been such a huge source of advance for our society. And we have to actually figure out what the right investments in the future are for the 21st century. Right now, the problem in our politics is it's so backwards looking. We have a set of people who are telling a story about how the old days were the good old days, and we just need to go back to the old policies of, the Great Society, or we have to go back to, some, a conservative ideal. And I think we have to make it new. That's this wonderful line from Ezra Pound that's always stuck in my brain. Make it new. It's not just true in literature and in art. It's in our social consciousness, in our politics. We have to sit there and we have to look at the world as it is and the challenges that are facing us in the world. And we have to throw away the old stuck policies where this idea somehow is inescapably attached to this other idea, and just break it all apart and put it together in new ways with fresh ideas and fresh approaches. And we also really need, one of the other things that we can really learn from technology platforms, and that we have to put into practice on a larger scale in our economics and in our social thinking, is the data-driven, data-informed decision making. At Google or Facebook, they're running or Amazon, they're running millions of experiments, where they're trying new combinations of data, new combinations of software, new combinations of user interface. They're measuring what happens, and then responding and adapting. And what you look at in our political life is somebody frames up an idea, we encode it in incredibly complex systems, paper-based systems. And then they really don't get updated very often. They get updated 20, 30 years, or they get updated simply by piling more stuff on. We don't kind of say, oh, that didn't work, take it out. Laws don't go away. They just get slightly modified and move forward. I'm actually reading a book right now about tax simplification, and it looks like every 32 years we have a big revamp of the income tax system. It's happened on a pretty regular clock, and the next 32-year period is 2018. I'm not sure we'll do it right on time, but it's like, why do we tax income when one of our problems is labor income, when one of our problems is that people don't have enough money. Meanwhile, we're awash in capital, and capital gains taxes are lower. And we have this belief system that says, well, that's better for the economy. Well, go figure it out. And the point of this book, I think it's T.R. Reid is the author. So I think we really need to refresh our politics. And I'm really hoping for some bold leadership to emerge over the next couple of elections where we break the old lock of the parties and where we have fresh thinking, because it's pretty clear that just a rehash of what went before is not going to be sufficient for the problems that we face. Again, I mentioned Wallace Stevens earlier. There's this wonderful passage from Esthétique du Mal. Out of what one sees and out of what one hears, who could have thought to make so many sensuous selves, as though the midday air were swarming with the metaphysical changes that occur merely in living as and where we live. Stevens had this immense insight into the way that we write the world. We don't just read it. We don't just see it. We don't just take it in. He also says in Ordinary Evening in New Haven, he talks about the dialogue between what he calls the naked alpha and the hierophant omega, the beginning, the raw stuff of reality, and what we make of it. And he also said reality is an activity of the most august imagination, and our job is to imagine a better future, because if we can imagine it, we can create it. But it starts with that imagination. And the future that we can imagine shouldn't be a dystopian vision of robots that are wiping us out, of climate change that is going to destroy our society. It should be a vision of how we will rise to the challenges that we face in the next century, and that we will build an enduring civilization, and we will build a world that is better for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, that we will become one of those long-lasting species rather than a flash in the pan that wipes itself out because of its lack of foresight. And we are at a critical moment in human history. In the small, we are at a critical moment in our economy where we have to make it work better for everyone, not just for a select few. But in the large, we really have to make it better in the way that we deal with long-term challenges and long-term problems. And we can't just sort of expect somehow that the market will magically come up with solutions. We have to actually rise to the challenges through political leadership, through intellectual leadership, through even religious leadership. We have to actually have a revolution, a moral revolution in ourselves, where we come to believe different things about what should be and what will be, because we make it so.